Good afternoon, everyone. My name is LaFontaine Oliver, and I have the absolute pleasure of serving this community as the president and general manager of WYPR. As a matter of housekeeping, I would ask that anyone who is connected to us via Zoom, if you would please mute your microphone, that would be helpful. I want to take just a couple of moments to give some thanks to some very important people who helped make today possible. First and foremost, I'd like to really thank my predecessor, Anthony Brandon, who I believe is joining us today, for his leadership and for his vision. It was his brainchild to launch the Anthony Brandon Fund to provide opportunities for emerging journalists. And we were thrilled during this really, really tough time to be able to marry the Anthony Brandon Fellowship Fund with our Report for America project, which is funded by the folks at the Ground Truth Project. So I want to thank Tony Brandon. I'd also like to thank all of the folks who donated to support the Anthony Brandon Fellowship Fund for your investment in this station. I'd like to thank the Transamerica Foundation for supporting WYPR with the first RFA Report for America match. And then also GBMC Healthcare for providing sponsorship support for health reporting on WYPR. This foundational support from GBMC made it possible for us to continue to pursue this health reporting beat. Finally, I'd like to thank the WYPR Board of Directors and Community Advisory Board for all of their support and guidance during these very, very tough times. And also to the staff of WYPR who have just been rock stars through all of this and who have continued to work very hard to provide the Baltimore community with news and information and perspectives that I think have been just very, very important. There's a saying that journalism is the first draft of history, and I think we can all agree that 2020 has been a historic year, and I just want to thank everyone for helping our news team to grow during this critical time in order to bear witness. And with that, I will turn it over to Danyell.
Good afternoon, and thanks again for joining our conversation on the importance of local news. I'm Danyell Irby. I am the Executive Director of News here at WYPR, and I am also the Executive Editor of our COVID-19 focused podcast, The Daily Dose. And during this conversation, you're going to meet our reporter, Sarah Y. Kim. She is our Report for America Corps member and Anthony Brandon Fellow, and she covers our new beats of health and housing. And we're hoping this conversation will give you some insight into Sarah's work, how she approaches it, and the value it adds to our news coverage and to the community we serve. And we're going to have some time later to take your questions. But I want to make a note that Sarah is in another area of our newsroom, not in the room here with me. Our producer who's running the camera is more than 6 feet away from me and wearing a mask, so we can all be at a safe social distance. So let's jump right into it. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks for that introduction.
Sure. So tell us, I'm sure lots of people are interested in how you came to Report for America, what piqued your interest in applying for it, and specifically why you wanted to work in Baltimore.
Right. So for those of you who don't know, RFA is a program by the Ground Truth Project that pairs local newsrooms across the country with journalists. And knowing that was really enough for me to get interested. Since I was a sophomore and became a news editor at my student paper, I became really interested in becoming a local reporter after college. And the reason for that being is I think local newsrooms are often underfunded and undersupported, and yet they are also the ones that are best positioned to give a really full dimensional picture of the communities that they're part of. And the reporters who are in the newsrooms are living in the communities that they represent. And that's something that I thought was very important, and I wanted to play some small role, whatever that was, in supporting a local newsroom somewhere in the country. Now, funnily enough, when I did apply, I was hoping to end up in Baltimore City, but I didn't think it was necessarily a possibility. But Baltimore taught me a lot about local journalism, and it's where I grew to understand the importance of local journalism. And then RFA sent me a message saying that YPR was interested. And for me, that was such a surprise and really great news, just because I've admired YPR for quite some time. And in my first couple of years, when I was still trying to get to know the city, really listening to the podcast, Out of the Blocks is my favorites. It was how I really immersed myself in the community, got to know who was who in the community, and really sort of immersed myself in like the sights and sounds of the different neighborhoods. And so it was really too good of an opportunity to pass, and it really checked all the boxes of what I wanted out of my post graduation career.
So now you and I have joked and talked about this often. Your challenges, your onboarding experience was really unique. I mean, we had to onboard you the beginning months of the pandemic back in June. You'd just graduated from Johns Hopkins University and you had not done any radio reporting. And you just returned to the US 4 years prior. So, can you speak to some of the unique challenges in each of those situations that you had to overcome as part of your onboarding and learning?
Right. So for the first challenge, which is onboarding during the pandemic, I think, ideally, any reporter wants to find ways to engage with the community and really form relationships with sources and really mingle with the people they're living with. That being said, that became a real challenge with the pandemic. You couldn't just like go to places and hang out with people. You couldn't have coffee with a source. Instead, you would Zoom them. And you try to mimic that sense of trying to form that relationship with your sources, but it gets tough because I think the sources and you can't help but feel like it's like a work meeting or like a very formal interview, even when you try to make it a conversation. So that was definitely a challenge I had. Also, basic things like interviewing became a little daunting in the first couple of weeks because I hadn't gone out of my house for quite some time. But everyone in the newsroom was very supportive and very helpful in terms of giving me access to different people I can talk to in the community. When I did speak to, for instance, health experts for the podcast, The Daily Dose, and did guest interviews with them, that was really helpful because that gave me a way to talk to them, if not face to face, at least have in depth conversations with them and get to know the health community here. And going to rallies, which was something I eventually got to do, was also a way for me to form relationships in the community and sort of see the grassroots movements in Baltimore firsthand. So that was a way I've been overcoming that challenge. The second challenge, which was radio reporting for the first time. So basically, I had no experience editing or recording audio before I came to YPR. My experience with audio was basically taking my phone out and like doing an interview and then transcribing the interview by hand. And then suddenly I had all these mics and intimidating gadgets that I was like, I don't really know what to do with these. And training was obviously a little erratic because I couldn't be here in person. I think it would have been a very different and a lot smoother process if I had been here and I could talk to people about how to do certain things. But eventually I learned it was a little slow at first, but I learned very, very quickly how to edit and record audio. And people were very patient with me as I tried to figure things out. And now it's become a lot easier. And I really do enjoy the producing of a story. And I think there are ways you can tell stories through audio that you can't really just by writing. Also, the writing process for radio was a real learning experience as well, because I think every reporter tries to be concise and succinct, but I think until I came here, I didn't realize how much work I had to do in terms of learning how to write in a more concise way. And you've been very helpful with that and trying to get me to really polish my words. The third challenge, which was being an American who just came to America, basically. I came here in 2016 for college. And I wouldn't say that was the defining experience of my YPR experience here so far, simply because people have been quite inclusive and very welcoming of me. And I haven't experienced any kind of discrimination because of what I look like or the culture I come from. But I think that being said, when you are a person of color, especially if you are from another country, it kind of underpins everything you do. And I think on your worst days, there are times when you have imposter syndrome, when you feel like maybe as an outsider, I shouldn't really have the right to cover this community, which isn't true. The notion that I am an outsider or that I don't have the right to immerse myself in another city. But that does like come to mind time to time. And also, I think there's added pressure when you are a person of color, especially woman of color, in journalism, and you realize you are very much underrepresented. I think Asian Americans in particular, and you worry about how your behavior or how your work reflects on other people who look like you. So every time you mess up, you are worried that that might hurt other reporters who look like you, even if they're not necessarily in the newsroom with you. Um, so that doesn't come up every day, every hour, but it's still there in the back of your head, and it comes when things get tough.
Well, you touched on the editing. Let's talk a little bit about that. And how you decide what stories you're going to cover, how you're going to approach them. I mean, I'm still in awe that you've been here, really less than 8 months. And, that's including the time it took you to get up to speed and learn. And you've done, some really big stories, on genomic research and the absence of people of color in those studies. You've gone out to some rallies on rent control. On evictions, and you've had a number of interviews with various leading medical professionals from Johns Hopkins to GBMC to University of Maryland Medical Center. So talk about how you approach stories and then from beginning to end and the editing process and why you chose those stories.
Right. I think the process is always a little bit different. Sometimes people come to you with the stories. They say, hey, here's this research paper, here's this event that you should go to. And so that makes it quite easy. And those are pretty good starting points for continuous themes. How I started to cover the eviction crisis, what people are saying is an upcoming eviction crisis, was going to hearings and really listening to different people in the community saying, I am behind on my rent, and here are the fears that I have now that the crisis is coming. Um, so really sort of listening in on the hearings, talking to people, or just like hearing what people have to say is a useful starting point. Also, in terms of the editing and vetting process for story ideas, I think something really helpful that you told me early on, I think it was back in June, when I was still kind of scrambling and not really sure how to manage my time very well. You said, don't get overwhelmed with the idea that you have to cover like a big story like right away. Just start with aiming for the low hanging fruit. And that kind of was a nudge that I really needed. I was like, I'm going to start with the things I can do easily. I need to accept that I am a new reporter and ease into my role. And I think from there on, the learning curve became steep. I was able to building on the small stories I was having and talking to health experts, talking to people here and there, was able to really familiarize myself more with my beat. Also, just to speak to the editing process here a little bit more. I think, like many local newsrooms, we do struggle with a small staff and there aren't enough people. I know that you have so much on your plate as both an editor and producer. But it's been really helpful to have different people from different journalistic backgrounds. Danyell, for instance, has both been part of NPR and TV. Joel, my other editor, comes from The Sun. And then there are other people who I work with who have a variety of experiences and insight to offer. So that has been very helpful in making me feel a little bit more confident about choosing my stories and how to edit. Yeah.
So, we talk a lot about community and the importance of local reporting. I think even now, in the past 8 months, more than ever, with the pandemic and how it's affecting each community. I mean, it has a huge impact. But when you're talking about a community that was already suffering from so many ills, from lack of housing, low income, health issues, other community issues, how has reporting in Baltimore, particularly during the past 8 months, I guess, redefined or broadened your perspective of the word and the meaning of the word community?
I think really just coming to Baltimore, not even starting my job here, really changed my perspective on community and how I approach my relationship to that. Before I came to Baltimore in 2016, I didn't really think very carefully about how I was engaging with the neighborhood I was living in Korea. I was just sort of a student. I didn't really think about how I was engaging with the community very carefully. And then you come to Hopkins, an institution like Hopkins, where you realize how different the makeup of that institution is from the surrounding Baltimore community. And you start becoming hyper aware of how the places you're part of and the institutions you're part of aren't necessarily representative of the people around you on the ground. So you become more attentive to who's in the room, who wasn't in the room, whose voices am I paying attention to, whose voices am I excluding. So that goes to the forefront of my mind, and it's become my approach as a reporter and why I valued reporting. And I think it's important when you live in a city like Baltimore, or really any city, to think not just about living there and like getting through your day to day, but thinking of how you can give back to the community. Because if you live in Baltimore and you benefit from it in some way, there has to be some way to give back to it. And for me, an easy access point for that was reporting. So that's how my perspective and my engagement with community changed.
What are some of the challenges and, what you're most proud of? Because again, you've done so much reporting on health, the pandemic. You've covered everything from, the impact on frontline workers to the mental health aspects on college students, on kids. Most recently, maybe the next thing, which is, what are employers going to do and the ethics around that? Will they require their workers to get the vaccine? So, what have you learned? What are some of the challenges with that, and what are some of the stories that you were most proud of so far?
Right. I think a story that I think is going to be a continuous theme throughout my job here has been the impact of housing on health and vice versa. That's really the story that it was one of my earliest stories, but it is the story that I'm proudest of, because not only did I get to talk to health experts and people in the community, but I think it forced me to reframe the story in a way that was very much truthful, and bring attention to the fact that housing is health. And I think that's something that we often overlook. When we see the number of people evicted, what doesn't come to mind instantly for some people is not just the economic impact, but the impact that has this coming year, the coming years on future generations. And I think that was an angle that, taking that, I was able to really understand my beat and how I wanted to approach it.
So, is there anything that before we go to some questions, and we have a couple I see in waiting, that I didn't touch on that you want to talk about, Sarah? Because there's so much, and we have such a short amount of time.
Yeah. I'm just going to say thank you to every single source I've ever had who's been generous enough in this very difficult and confusing time to speak with me and share their stories. And to the staff at YPR for being very patient with me throughout this process as I figure things out in the station.
Oh, one thing I did want to touch on is the importance of, before we go to questions, is having a mentor, because you did mention that we are a small staff. We're a staff total of six, and that's myself included. And even though we're all safe social distancing, it's been really difficult because you're not out in the street as often as you would be as a reporter. We're all in our homes or, separate. So, talk to me a little bit about the importance of, having a peer mentor in the newsroom, which I assigned you.
Yeah, so Emily Sullivan has been kind of my informal peer mentor, and I think that's been very useful because she would tell me when Danielle is tied up. I would ask her questions like, "How do I go about reporting this? What are some basic step by step things I can do to make sure the story goes smoothly?" I'm someone who does benefit from a lot of like micromanaging, kind of like being told like, here's like what you have to do, and having someone who's around my age and kind of like knows like my mental space, but also has a lot more experience than I do, has been really helpful. And again, it speaks to, despite the small size of our newsroom, how I've been able to get like a diversity of perspectives and insights. That's been really helpful.
Thanks. So, my producer, I'm getting a note saying if you have questions, please type them in the chat. That is the best way to get them to us. And I'm going to go to the first one, which is more a question and a compliment, which is from Sheila Cass, which a lot of us, probably like a lot of us, she did not realize, listening to you on the air, your produced pieces, that you were just learning radio for the first time. And she was struck how professional you sound. So, with that compliment, I want you to talk a little bit about your writing and, I guess that rigorous process with me. Don't talk about the torture part, just the good part.
Yeah, I think despite not having experience, it was a little easier to think about the way I sound, how
Wow, talk about punching above your weight.
the way I sound and like how my stories come off on audio. Because whenever we do an edit and I call Danielle for an edit, she would have me read through the whole thing. She would have me play my sound for her. Sometimes she would be like, here's where you should play this bit of music, here's how you should do this. And I think when you say a story aloud, this is something I did before, but not as rigorously until now. Reading the story aloud makes you really think of like how awkward certain phrases might sound that you didn't realize were awkward. Really focusing on how a story sounds makes you realize how unrefined a story could be when you didn't do that. It's like you have long sentences, you really focus on having like short, trim words. That has been very helpful, just having you walk me through that process every time.
Mhm. And we've got I guess, a question and a comment from Anna, which is about seems surprised that we have just a staff of 6. So, with all the overwhelming issues that we want to cover, that I want you to cover, how do you decide? I mean, let's think about a couple of your recent stories. How do you decide, particularly on any given day? We have competing news conferences, press conferences, health stories. How do you decide, what's going to have the most value added for the community?
Well, I think of how it's relevant to my beat first off. Is it really prioritizing or addressing the concerns and needs of people who are most vulnerable in the city as opposed to someone who has a lot of power? And I guess that is really my priority first off, is like promoting the voices of people who aren't usually included and thinking of how I can amplify those voices. And that's really where my priority stands as a reporter.
Mhm. And we have another question. I cannot see the name of who it's from, but who found it interesting that, again, that we have such a small staff and that we're able to uh, cover so many issues, and they wanted us to speak to some of our other beats here. So I won't let you address that, Sarah. I'll just do that quickly. Is that we have Emily Sullivan, who covers City Hall, who was fantastic on all the races, the mayoral races, the city council race. Rachel Bay, who I say keeps our government honest. She covers the state house. And John Lee is our intrepid Baltimore County reporter. He was most recently all over the Baltimore County school ransomware attack. And we also have Joel McCord, who's our news director, who which is also really important, which is editing our web copy, because we do consider ourselves a multi-platform newsroom, and most of all of our radio stories end up on the web, but some stories are web only, and it's important to have good editing on that. And Joel also enjoys covering some Chesapeake Bay stories, which, again, we don't have a separate reporter to cover that, so we cover what we can. I have another question on there, which is about becoming a really thoughtful interviewer and how you approach that, and particularly your contributions to the Daily Dose. I'm not sure if many on this call know that you also do long form interviews for the Daily Dose with leading health professionals in our community. So, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so that process became a lot easier because Danielle, you and Aaron Henkin, who's another host of the podcast, really walk through the questions and how they sound and making sure that they sound conversational. A struggle that I had and still kind of have is the questions when I write them, they sound kind of mechanical sometimes, and really like encouraging me to approach it as a conversation. This doesn't have to be scary. It's just a chat. So that has been kind of a very informative experience. And talking to the health experts is always fun because I don't have a background in public health, and having people really open my eyes to different health issues, not just COVID, but the ways COVID intersects with things like mental health, um, cardiology. These are things that really help me understand what issues are at stake, and what stories to keep an eye out for going forward.
One of your big stories were the genomic story. I want you to talk about that because I was really surprised to learn that during Alzheimer's research all these years, that no people of color were included in that study. And I think you were surprised as I was, and I really challenged you on that because I had not heard that. So can you speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah, so the story began when I got an email about a research paper that recently discovered the lack of inclusion, or really the exclusion, of Black subjects from genomic research. And it was very alarming to me and to Danielle as well. And so it was really the interviewing process was quite simple. I got to speak with all the people who'd written the paper and the community member here who helped bring that research to the community. And just speaking with them and the significance of the report kind of opened my eyes to how this is a real problem. And often the things that shock us are the things that were there all the time, and we just didn't really pay attention to it. And Danielle really grilled me on kind of like, here's how you need to be careful about writing a story like this, especially concerning racial inequity. And
Mhm.
that was a very informative story for me. That I didn't really know about, and it just kind of spoke to how there are all these issues that maybe we're just not paying attention to that are just below the surface.
All right, and we have, I guess, a big question, which is about your career goals. Jerome wants to know what's next for you,
Oh God.
and I
Um,
hope it includes being here for a while, Sarah. So be careful.
yeah. I mean, yes, I would like to be here for some time. I've signed on for a second year, so that's going to be um, quite some time. I'm not trying to think too much about what I'm going to do immediately after that. I don't want to plan too much ahead. But I would like to be a journalist. I think that is sort of a long-term career goal. In terms of other things, if in case you're wondering, I do like to write for fun, like fiction, poetry, and things like that. So that's something I kind of like to do on the side. But in terms of like a stable career, I would prefer to be a journalist and stay in Baltimore as long as I can.
So, what do you think? One of the questions from our colleagues here is that you have great reporting skills, but again, you're still so new at this. Again, I really want to compliment you on the breadth and the depth of the work that you've done. But what more do you think you need to learn to, I guess, so to speak, up your game?
Right. So I think there's so much really. Having started in this pandemic, on the scene reporting is still something that I haven't done as much as I would have otherwise. So being more comfortable with that and knowing how to go on the scene immediately is something I want to become um, more comfortable with. Learning how to conduct interviews is still an ongoing process. Learning how to break news, I think, has been a challenge for me. I think finding the stories in my beat and really familiarizing myself with the different officials in the city has been somewhat of a challenge because people can be difficult to reach out to, difficult to get back to. So that's something I want to improve on. There's just so many things, but I'm working on it, and hopefully I'll be a much better reporter this time next year.
And someone had a question about, which is something we often grapple with in the newsroom, is telling your stories aloud. I guess what they meant is when you have a really good story that may not be great for broadcast, but may be good for print, or web only. How do you decide that?
So we haven't really had an instance where we felt like a story couldn't go online, excuse me, on air, but could only go on print. Um, but I think that was something I grappled with in the beginning, where I wasn't used to the notion that a typical story on breaking the news of the day was going to be 1 minute long. That was something that was kind of mind-boggling to me. Um, but approaching it, step by step, like dividing the stories into different spots or
Mhm.
phasing out the stories. I think there are many different ways you can sort of schedule the different stories you produce. So that has been quite helpful. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm getting the kind of wrap up sign from our producer. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. All everyone on the call, GBMC, the Anthony Brandon Fellowship, Report for America. Because of all of you, Sarah is able to do the great work that she does. Do you have any parting words, Sarah?
Just thank you to everyone who's made my position here possible. And I couldn't really ask for a better job here.
Great. Thank you.